My name is Sandy Hiltz. I brought in a tea service and a selection of photographs that belong to Mona Parsons and were buried actually by her during the Second World War.
The Nazi invasion came as a surprise to the Dutch, who had maintained a policy of neutrality and hadn't engaged in a European war in more than a century. In fact, the Netherlands had stronger bonds with Germany than Britain. This betrayal fueled the rise of the Dutch resistance, which was organized by the Dutch Communist Party, churches, and various independent groups. Their activities included concealing thousands of Jews and Allied servicemen from the Nazis. Among those who risked execution by taking part in the resistance was Mona Parsons, a Nova Scotian nurse who performed as a chorus girl in the Ziegfeld Follies in New York. Just prior to the war, she had moved to Holland as the bride of a Dutch millionaire.
Sandy, welcome to Militaria, and thank you for bringing in these wonderful artifacts. Could you tell us what it is and what their significance are?
Absolutely. So we have a sterling silver tea service made in England that belonged to Mona Parsons. So we have the under tray, the coffee pot, hot water pot, teapot, creamer, and the sugar bowl.
And how did this come in your possession?
Well, Mona Parsons is a relative of ours, and it's sort of just come down through the generations. Mona Parsons was part of the Allied war effort in Nazi-occupied Holland. During the war, she and her husband, who was a wealthy Dutch businessman, harbored a downed British airman on their estate. And this actually was in that house, and as the Nazis were approaching, was buried to keep it safe.
Obviously, in my mind, the reason to do this was to keep this out of the Germans' hands, otherwise they'd never see it again.
Exactly, yes, yeah.
They felt, either her or her husband felt, that this was important enough to, package up and bury to keep out of the hands of the Germans. And having the faith that the war would end and it wouldn't be the Germans that won, and they'd be able to dig this back up and move on with their lives. So they obviously felt that they were going to survive as well. So Sandy, it seems that it's just been recent that Mona is actually being honored for what she did during the war. And I was wondering if you could tell us what has happened in recent years.
Absolutely. So in the mid-2000s, they did a Heritage Minute featuring Mona. And Heritage Day in Nova Scotia in 2018 was named in her honor. And they've actually erected a statue in Wolfville. And throughout the course of the years, there have even been a few little plays and so on, and local productions done about her experience during the war.
So she's gone from being known a bit in Nova Scotia to actually taking some prominence in Canadian history.
Absolutely. Over the course of her life, there were a few articles in newspapers here and there, but really there was no firm acknowledgement of her significance in the war effort until recently.
Right, and besides, of course, her effort with the resistance and harboring the pilots, she has the significance, and not that it's a wonderful thing, but she was the only female Canadian to have been held by the Germans during the Second World War.
Absolutely, yeah.
So Sandy, as a family member, what was your impression of Mona and her life?
She was always sort of regarded as, in some ways, a larger-than-life character. She had an immense personality, and she sort of was over the top in her way of dressing and manner of speech and everything. So she was a great character. And of course, amongst her being that wonderful character and a lot of fun, she was also always respected for her acts during the war.
So Mona made it back to the Netherlands, and then eventually her husband, William, made it back as well, so they both survived the war.
Yes, that's right. They returned to live on their estate, and I think very much went back to living how they did before the war. But it had taken a terrible toll on his health, and he only survived, 9 or so years after the war. She only spent at most a year or two in the Netherlands and then returned home.
And then when she got back here, that's when she met Harry Foster, I assume, and then remarried?
Yes, exactly. They married in '57, and then they lived in Chester for the remainder of their marriage. And then after he died, she moved back to Wolfville.
So Sandy, we spoke earlier about Mona's trial, in which she was found guilty and sentenced to death. However, she obviously wasn't executed. Do you know anything about how that stay of execution occurred?
Yes, it's a really wonderful story. She really did it just through writing a letter, which I should imagine must have been fairly strongly worded and convincing. One of the senior Nazi officers in the area found her sentence commuted to life in prison.
What I understood, though, is that this general was also a friend or a social acquaintance of a friend of hers. So I think she used that sort of connection to leverage the pity, for the lack or compassion, I guess, and to commute the sentence, because the judge was very impressed at how she conducted herself during the trial and suggested to her that she do that.
Right, and of course that's what the Heritage Minute focuses on, is that moment in the courtroom,
So Mona was moved from various prisons, and they were more work camps than prisons. However, in one she was responsible for making fuses for bombs. In another one, she fabricated wings out of wood, and there was talk of how the splinters would get infected because, of course, they weren't fed properly and such. Is there any family lore that expands upon that?
Yes, so there's a really wonderful family story surrounding that, and it was at a time which she was directed to start knitting socks for the German soldiers. And the family story is that she began knitting knots into the bottom of the socks so that it would be uncomfortable when they were marching.
Oh, that's wonderful. It just goes on with the resistance movement. You know, every little bit made a difference. So Sandy, where does this tea service reside in your family now?
So this resides actually on our sideboard, much as it did in Mona and Billy's house in Holland. The number of objects she was allowed to bring back with her after her husband died were limited because some of the other pieces went to other family members. So this was obviously a piece of significance to her.
Does it get any use?
No, it doesn't, I'm afraid. It's not the most practical thing for today's life.
So I assume that the future of this artifact is remaining on your sideboard?
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
And who gets to polish it?
That would oftentimes be me or my father. It's a group effort.
Well, thank you so much for bringing it in. I think it's a wonderful tie to Mona Parsons. It's actually something physical that we can actually see and touch, as opposed to just the stories about a wonderful woman. And thanks again for coming and bringing this into Militaria.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
For me, the lessons we take away from this story is that everyone can resist. Everyone can do a little bit in order to make the enemy's life a little bit worse. And you don't have to be a general, you don't have to be a rifleman. You can do little things like Mona and knit that sock that's got that big honking knot in the bottom. You know, every little thing accomplishes something, and a whole bunch of little things is a big thing.